Hello and welcome back to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Friday, May 19th. Our topic today is teen and young adult mental health. Many of you will recall that a few months ago, the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, had a report that came out, a youth risk survey that contained a lot of disturbing data, I think. It talked about depression rates among teens, and a lot of very disturbing stuff. So here to talk with us about that and break that down and kind of analyze it a bit, we're really pleased to have with us today three great panelists to discuss it. With us today we have Megan Brooks, who is the Mental Health Director at Burn Burton Academy. She's been there since 2013. Dr. Bob Hemmer is a psychologist who specializes in child, adolescent, and family psychotherapy. He's been working in the Bennington, Manchester area since 1997. And Lori Zief is the Emergency Services Director at Rutland Mental Health Services. Thank you all for making the time for this. Really appreciate you being here today and helping us understand this very complicated and difficult subject. I guess I thought just to get us started, we could maybe just go around the table and have each of you comment a little bit about what your takeaways were from the report and what stood out to you. Megan, why don't we have you get us started?
Yeah. So I think that the rates seem alarmingly high. I think for somebody who's sort of working in the field for so long, and at the high school we do administer the YRBS, so for 10 years, every other year, we're sort of digesting all the results. So I don't want to say it blew me out of the water, because I've seen on a day-to-day basis the increase. I can see how somebody not in the field seeing these is incredibly alarming. I think the date is really important, because the YRBS was administered in 2021, which of course was sort of in the midst of COVID. So I do think that this data is far higher than years prior, because I think we were about a year into COVID at that point. Was it 20? Yeah. Just about a solid year, when most students were either not at school or doing sort of a hybrid approach. So I think we also have to take that into consideration. We did just do the YRBS about a month ago. Those results won't be out for 6 months or so it will be really interesting to really compare those 2 years.
Dr. Bob?
So the biggest thing for me was kind of what they said in one of the summary statements, where they were trying to put it all together. So even though the data set was, as you said, in the midst of COVID, I think the things that parents and the rest of the audience can take away is that comprehensive approaches that promote help-seeking behaviors, connections to trusted adults, and supportive peers, plus engagement in community activities. So in the rebound from COVID, just basically getting outside is going to be helpful in and of itself. But then reinforcing the idea of there are people out there you can trust, you can talk to, and that idea of being able to reach out, aside from looking it up on Google or somewhere else. But things like, I think we need, as psychologists, we probably need to move back towards group therapy and community building, so there's more understanding and mentoring for the kids today.
Yeah, I agree 100%. My takeaway was no surprise at all, and I think a difference between actually Megan and I, as Megan sees sort of a broad range of kids. She's got healthy kids, she's got less healthy kids, she's got everything in between. And even Dr. Bob is seeing kids who have at least families that support them seeking out to get help. So I, as the director of the crisis team, I'm seeing sort of really only people who haven't gotten appropriate help. The appropriate help hasn't been helpful for whatever reason, or they're just in places that the idea of getting help is not even a consideration. And exactly to Bob's point, I think the promoting the ability to talk about things is probably my biggest takeaway of what we need to do to be able to understand where the issues are and manage the problems before they hit the crisis team. I think that the two biggest factors are isolation, 100% agree with that, and I think we have a huge lack of predictability in life generally for kids. I think that's a very big change. I think there's the COVID piece. Sneezes and coughs suddenly became very scary. I think there's a huge housing issue, so that just really Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Right.
I think
Yes.
we've got, and I think we can pull 1,000 things into that, including climate change.
Well, I think we'll have a chance to touch upon all of that. I guess the biggest surprise to me when I first heard of it was the difference in the gender differences. That girls were reporting much higher levels of depression and suicidal thoughts than boys did. Dr. Bob, it was just a couple months ago we had
Yes.
you and Jason Pergament here talking about difficulties boys were experiencing trying to find their way going forward, and yet this report seems to indicate that girls are having much of a greater struggle. And I guess I just wondered, did that ring true to you all, or what?
It did, but
Yeah, well, I think it's the key word there is reporting. I think
Right.
girls are far more likely to
Right.
talk about it. This isn't a big
Yeah.
surprise. I think we're very fortunate that we have a male psychologist in our community because boys like talking to men,
Right.
and there aren't a lot of male therapists out there. We're so fortunate also to have Jason Pergament, and I'm sure you feel that. But
Yeah.
I think I just think, again, getting back to getting people to talk about things is the fact that girls talk and boys
Yeah.
culturally don't.
Yeah, and I was definitely not surprised to see that data difference. I mean, even at the health center at Burn girls come in far more than males. And the other thing too is I think, especially in adolescence, like boys, their depression looks differently. So teachers and support staff or whomever might take a different approach with them. Like maybe it's dean's office because maybe it's behavioral, behavioral things,
Yes.
when really it's like they actually need to be coming to the health center. So I do think it looks differently in boys often, but also, it goes back generations that, the whole, boys don't talk, you need to be tough and
Right.
you've got this,
just walk it off.
Yeah, but I do think, especially the last couple of years, we've seen far more males coming into the health center.
You
Not
only
always-
refer me boys. I mean,
Yeah.
it's always,
not always on their own, but like, maybe a parent will reach out or a teacher, and then we will reach out to that
Or the
student.
dean of students.
Or the dean of students. And we'll reach out to that student, and oftentimes they'll be like, no, I'm good, I got this. But a lot of times they're like, I'd like to come in and talk. So I think it's shifting slowly but surely.
So I just want to throw this interesting thing that I found, and I apologize, I forget where I found it, but way back when Facebook bought, was it Instagram, I think? Mark Zuckerberg and his team wanted to know what the impact was, what the use of this platform, what the impact would be on the population. So the data obtained was kept secret until the Wall Street Journal extracted it somehow. So Meta, the new name of Facebook, possessed that data that supported the hypotheses that heavy use of Instagram causes adolescent girls to feel increasingly insecure and unhappy. So they knew this all along. But they're like, oh no, we don't want to, let's not make that known. So now we have to figure out what to do with that. And that was one of the things that, as searching around trying to answer the question, I found this gem. And it's like,
Yeah.
what are we doing to ourselves?
Right.
Right, because I think that reaction of what happens to any of us, I don't think it's just adolescents. I think
No.
very healthy adults are watching everyone else's 3-second reel of their fabulous
Right.
weekend with their fabulous family, and nobody is talking about how they feel really.
Yeah, there's a really great program. It's called Behind the Post, I think. And it came from, I don't know, a boarding school in Virginia or something. But basically, it really dives into like the 10 minutes leading up to like the post that was made, because obviously we only post like really positive things. And oftentimes it's like devastating, you know, what led up to that. But we don't show that. We cannot underestimate the role that social media, and not even just social media, but just the technology of the phone itself. You know, the past few years, and I hate to like blame everything on COVID, but when everybody went, you know, when things shut down, the phone was your lifeline, and it's hard to like get those reins back now. I mean, even my 10-year-old has a phone, and it's like I have to holler up, and I'm like, you know, come downstairs. You've been up there for an hour. You know, it's hard. It just has become the norm, and it's toxic.
Why do you think social media has such a, you know, seems like a very problematic impact? I'm trying to search for the right word here. Every time I've either read an article or listened to a podcast about this subject, it always seems like social media and cell phones or smartphones leap right to the top of the chart. This is where, I mean, I've seen studies now going back to like 2010 or 2011, you know, 10, 12 years ago, where it's like almost at that point when smartphone use really kind of took off, and Facebook became Meta and everything else, and Instagram became a go-to for so many people, that's when you started to see the trend line arching up in terms of depression. And I guess I just wondered what you all thought. Is social media the big villain here, or not?
Let's be clear at a basic level. I'm sure you guys know this, but let's be clear. The smartphone and all the social media are designed to reinforce you for staying on the page or on the device. It's designed behaviorally. High-level technical behavioral studies were done, probably not published, probably not known, but it's designed to keep you on it for the advertising dollars and just to keep it in use. So that's the basic thing you need to understand about that.
I think it's the immediate gratification piece. I think it's highly addictive. I consider myself to be a pretty emotionally healthy adult. I love to read. I have a very hard time sitting and reading without looking at my phone, as though I'm running a small country every time a text comes in. It's ridiculous. And rationally, I know it's ridiculous. But if I have trouble controlling that urge to constantly look at the phone, then how are we expecting 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds to focus on the history lesson when they,
And I think too, it's like there's so many different ways that the phone and the social media and the internet itself can be toxic, right? Like maybe you just have an anxious person who's constantly going down the Google rabbit hole of like, what is this on my you know, they have a lump and now they have cancer, right? So there's that. They can get any answer, and it's usually not the right answer. But then there's too, like the kids who are already feeling left out, and they're scrolling on Instagram and they're seeing the party that they're not at, right? There's, you know, there's so many different ways that it can be misused.
Well, there's so many different breakups. Because when we hear about that all the time, where, you know, there you were at the party that I was not at, and you're with this guy, and boom. And yes.
Right, and then the second something really awful happens in the world, it's right there on your feed.
There on
like
your screen.
You just can't escape.
When we think about youth and health and mental health, we really, a very short time ago, used to be able to protect our children from a lot of things. I could say to my son, who's now 33, I think, almost, when he was 12, this is not something for you to worry about. This is a grown-up thing. We will figure it out if we're talking about climate change or homelessness or whatever. We can't say that anymore to our kids.
And you might have had a couple of days to be able to prepare, right? Like the shooting, I'm trying to think, the shooting that was at the Christian school or something in Tennessee last month. I spent like all day, I'm like, how am I going to talk to Ava about this? Like, what should I say? And she came home already knowing about it. Everybody was already talking about it, you know.
So interestingly, there's a school around here in this area, and when 9/11 happened, they played the tape, like basically on repeat, because they just put the news channel on. What I don't know which it was, but they just left it running. And in that school alone, there was a significant spike in post-traumatic stress disorder, just
So
related to that.
interesting.
Yeah, so I remember this very, very clearly talking to my colleagues when I was in the bigger practice, just like, are you getting these calls? Yeah, are you getting these? It's like, and it was all from this school.
And at the time, I lived on the other side of Vermont in a very small school that had no cell service until actually recently, where Leland and Gray is in Townsend. And my son, I was able to call the babysitter, say, please keep the younger children there for the afternoon, so that the older kid, who was going to have to know about it, my husband was in California on business, it was a disaster, so that I can manage my school-age kid comes home and I'm able to sit him down in a thoughtful way and say, this thing happened, this is what we have to worry about, this is what we don't have to worry about, blah, blah, blah. That's a very different ability to control a
Yes.
10-year-old's response to a
Correct.
tragedy.
Yes. Yeah, and like I
Crazy.
said, it was just so that little sample, here, not documented, not researched. It's what and one of your later questions was about the gun violence and the lockdown drills and the shooting. All this stuff is building your anxiety up to a certain level, and it's not going to take much of an incident to trigger kind of classic PTSD symptoms.
Well, let's talk about that. You gave me the perfect segue into what was going to be my next question there about, we've seen it seems like a real uptick in mass shootings, gun violence, shootings at schools. That's got to be pretty. I mean, I'm thinking back to my own time in high school and grade school, which is a long time ago. And we just never thought about that.
Right.
Me and my friends, that was just never on the table at all. And I find myself wondering, even if students, have to go through a lockdown drill, I mean, what are they thinking about?
Exactly.
Why are we having to do this? I mean, I would think that would really prey on it would prey on my sort of sense of
Sure.
security.
Right, especially kindergartners who are doing this, right? I mean, high school students can at least perhaps understand the why and know that it could happen here, but you can't really say it probably won't anymore.
Increasingly, you can't.
But and it's hard to be able. It's hard when you can't actually reassure the students of that anymore.
And it's also harder with like an AR-15.
Yeah.
Because if you've got the automatic version, which you can get, you can pop that thing. You can pop off 100 rounds in a few seconds.
Yep.
I remember when there was another dean at your school, Todd, and there was a problematic youth. And so he was pulled up in his beater, his pickup truck, right? And he was just a real Vermonter, a little bit problematic, but a good kid. And so the dean and I were leaning on the window, talking to this guy, and I was like, we're going to have an assessment because he's got a machete and an axe in the back of his truck here, And he's like, yeah, but he's also got some split wood, so we know what that's all about. But you can't do that anymore, right? You can't assume that because of the way the society is.
Yeah. And I think getting back to your initial point about creating places and time for being able to talk about it. One of the challenges is, and I run the team that does the reacting, is if a kiddo comes into school and says, like, I just failed another test, I just don't even want to be here tomorrow, Megan kind of has to call the crisis team to think about that. So there's a big reaction. Sometimes it's the right reaction, sometimes it's the wrong reaction, and we're all caught up in sometimes we have to call DCF at times that we really don't think is going to be helpful, is probably going to be actually harmful on some level, but we have to do it. We have a lot less room to sort of do what our clinical best sense tells us to do.
Yeah, there's no way you can clinically assess if we need to do this. It's like we have to do it.
Right.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. Right, to your point about the machete and
Yes.
calling the crisis team, you're going to call me and I'm going to be like, okay. And then we go out and we do the thing and the kid's pissed off and now the kid is not going to tell you that he's
Yeah.
got a machete next time.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Complicated.
I was wondering, is it your sense that this is a particularly U.S. problem, or is this a global thing? This is kind of going a little bit beyond the CDC report, but I just wondered, as you kind of follow all these issues, is this a problem in other countries comparable to the U.S., or is it something particular to us?
It just happened in Serbia,
Right.
right? Just
What, we
2
talking
weeks
school
ago?
shootings? What
Yes.
are we talking specifically?
Right, are we talking
shootings.
about, okay, I
Okay.
wasn't
There was
sure
a
if
school
you're talking
shooting in
mental health or
Serbia a
school
couple of
shootings.
weeks ago. I think that Britain, I know, does, but I think Europe has more overt gun controls, and so I think it's probably less prominent there. I think that it's just that the climate, the next question, kind of the climate crisis, the war in Ukraine, and all this stuff is building to this point that the younger people are like, what are people going to do about it?
Yeah. I think I did look that one up. We are like 29th in the world for depression, 23rd for suicide, and I think the measures are sort of, I don't think that they're exact at all, but I think that kind of puts us right where I would have expected us to be. I don't think we're particularly terrible worldwide, but I also think we have the resources in that we might expect ourselves to be a lot better
Right.
at managing it.
Right.
Well, you mentioned climate change there, so when we jump down that one, I mean, I would imagine, again, for a lot of kids, not being able to say, gee, when in 20 or 30 years the world is going to be basically like it is now, and I can plan to go forward and have a career and have a family,
Right.
and all of that, is something that must be, weigh on their minds a lot. I mean, that, again, thinking back to my own time as a younger person, I mean, I never thought about that at all. Of course, the
Yeah.
world was just going to go on. We were going to
Right.
have hurricanes and tornadoes and bad snowstorms, but that was just part of the deal. And now it seems like every time there's an unusual climate event, we sort of go, well, here it comes.
Yeah.
And now we're not talking about this is something that's going to be happening 20 or 30 years down the road.
Right.
No, now all the science is saying we've got maybe a couple of years or 5 years before we hit a tipping point where things will go, it's so bad that it won't be possible to kind of recover quickly. As you talk to youngsters, is this something that comes up frequently, this whole issue? Or?
Yeah, and I don't hear, I mean, often in the health center, I mean, we're dealing with students who are really worrying about like today and tomorrow. So it's definitely not one of like the top 5 stressors, at least that they're vocalizing when they're coming in. But I also think there's a huge pool of students who are the students that maybe don't come to the health center, and they're thinkers and they're looking at their future, and I think it is a real stressor for those students. A lot of the students that I'm working with are, like I said, they're in crisis and they're worrying about like where they're going to get dinner tomorrow, and I'm not sure like that's sort of in the forefront of their mind, but it certainly is a big stressor.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think I don't hear about it a lot from the kiddos that we assess for crisis because they're also worried about much more sort of immediate things. I will say that I have 3 young adult children. That is a huge conversation with them.
Yeah, sort of that age, like the
Yeah.
mid-20s, early 30s.
So when I'm talking to older kids, that come to my practice and stuff, I'm always kind of asking like, well, so what's next? What's the future? What are you thinking about this track or that track? There's alternate tracks out there. If you want to be a doctor or a teacher, there's a standard track. And a lot of kids are saying, maybe I'll get married, but I don't know if I want to have kids. And one of my daughters is that way too. It's like, I don't think I'm going to have kids. I mean, look at the planet. I mean,
Yeah.
why would I put someone through that?
Right.
It's like,
I do hear that far more these days. And of course they're in high school and their mind is probably going to change 5 times. But the last few years, like I've heard more students make comments
Yeah,
like that, like,
just
oh, I'm
like,
not having kids.
I'm not
like,
having
oh,
kids.
okay.
And then what they're saying is well, it'd be crazy to bring them into this mess.
Right. And not even just climate, right? I mean, just the world right now is
Right.
so divided,
Yes.
right? Like take climate change out, just
Right,
everything.
Right.
So, what is the pathway out of this then? I mean, how do we kind of fix it? I guess I also wonder, is this sort of part of a cycle of depression, anxiety, and recovery, or whatever that goes up and down? I mean, if we were to look back to, let's say, the 1950s or 60s or something like that,
Right.
go back that far. I'm not sure if there's data and study available on that, but I mean, is it a case where this sort of goes up and goes down, or is the trend line more of a kind of a longer-term upward track that is now just hitting even higher levels than might have been the case in the past? But
Well, if we theorize about like because I think you're right, there's no data, but you theorize about like World War II, right? So there was a thing, it was by these people, and we took care of it, and it ended. And then there was kind of a rebound, right? I mean, we helped Japan, we helped Germany, I think there was rebounds ultimately there. You could theorize that there was a rebound. I'm not sure that today, the graph going up like this, I'm not sure what the rebound is going to be, because who's going to create the rebound?
Right.
Well, should we ask Congress?
You clinging to the camera. Well, and I think too, so many, like, if there's a rebound, I think it's going to be a while.
Yes.
Like social media is not going anywhere. The phones, aren't going anywhere. So many of the things that kind of got us to where we are right now are simply not going anywhere.
I think a question is, have we hit bottom to the point that Congress or whoever is funding whatever we're doing is going to start to fund proactive management of problems before they become a crisis? And I can tell you that the crisis teams at designated agencies statewide are funded to react, period. We are not funded to go out and meet with the Megan Brooks of the world to provide programming on zero suicide for her students. We're not funded to even really call Dr. Bob and say, tell me about like what you're seeing right now in your office and what should we be looking at. Well, so we do some of that, but we're not funded for it. And so what happens is when our need to react goes up, our ability to do those kinds of things goes down. So I think we have to, that is like, vote for the right people, vote for funding for those things. I think in the short term, and again, getting back to the first thing that Bob said is around isolation, I think we have to take away the silos. And I think what I'm doing in Rutland is trying to putting together a program to bring sort of Rutland mental health crisis out into the schools so that we can interact with youth when they're not in crisis, when they're maybe more able to hear us say the things that we're saying. I think the taking away the silos of the private practitioners, the schools, the community mental health, the hospital, the practitioners. We know that people who die by suicide almost always have seen a medical practitioner 6 months prior to the event. There are things we can do if we can all connect in better ways. And it's not that I think we all know this. The challenge is, you're not going to get paid by Blue Cross to come and sit with the crisis team and talk about what you could do differently. Like it comes down to time and money.
Neither are SVMC Pediatrics. This is great. What you're talking about is prevention, and as we all know, no one wants to pay for prevention.
Right. Although I think I have a grant to pay for a little bit of it this
Good.
year.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right.
So yeah, Blue Cross Blue Shield isn't going to pay for preventative stuff. They're a great company, but they no one does that. How do you train a child, an adolescent, to recognize the signs? We have all those, recognize the 5 signs, and we have all these little prompts and stuff like this. But actually bringing that into the health class, and then even beyond that, so that the kids know that there are people out there, and you can go to them, and you can trust that you can access them, and you can trust them.
Right.
And I think the other piece too of not where do we go from here, but is this is this a forever thing, and is this where we are? Is so much of it too is generational, and just like the generational poverty that you simply can't get out of, nor do a lot of families try to get out of it. And so those are the cases that are really, really tough. And most of the students that I'm working with right now that are sort of like in crisis and the neediest, it's the lack of support at home, functioning parenting, maybe substance use.
There's a really well documented statistic around family life that is, I think, I always go back to this, I think it is sort of a microcosm of the issue, which is family dinner time. The percentage of
like,
families
wait, what is that?
have dinner, right, and I actually think I wrote but the percentage of families that have dinner on a daily basis these days is exceedingly low, like less than 10%. And I have it written here somewhere. But if we go back to the 1950s, almost everyone, almost every night, sat down at the table at 5 o'clock.
If you were late for dinner, you were doomed.
Right.
In
Yeah.
my house, I was the oldest. I am the oldest of 9. You were doomed.
Yeah. So, okay, in October 2019, they said 29% of Americans said they sat down and had dinner every day. But if you asked Americans 50 or over about their childhood, it was like almost everyone, almost all the time. And that was across socioeconomic barriers.
That was, yes,
absolutely.
yes. The basketball court was totally empty in my neighborhood at dinner time.
And the other thing that we go back to is stores and things to do were not open on Sundays because people spent their time with their families.
Yeah.
We had a lot more structure around no structure. And
that's a good one.
Yeah, because
A lot more structure around no structure.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to look at it.
TV went off at a certain point because there was no more programming on.
Right.
That's
They have the
no
cute little
longer
symbol.
a thing.
There's always something to watch.
There's always something to watch. There's always something to Google. And the stores are always open. Restaurants are Amazon's. You can shop 24/7. All of that.
And the drones will be bringing your package tonight.
Immediate gratification.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, but we're not going to uninvent that, are we?
No, we're not going to
No, right.
And how do we adapt
It's all
to
here.
it?
But I
Right.
think the
Adapting
more we can encourage families to think about the fact that sitting down and feeding each other literally and figuratively, nurturing each other literally and figuratively, looking a child in the eye and saying, "Tell me about your day," as opposed to a text saying, "How was basketball practice," is huge. And again, I don't know, have we hit bottom? I don't know, but at some point, I hope that we're going to start to realize that kind of connection is so important.
Yep, bringing people back together.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, to touch up on a point I think you were making a moment ago there, Lori, about, I think you all did, payment for mental health services. I mean, every time there is one of these tragic gun shootings, it's always somebody's going to say, well, it's a mental health problem. It's not the gun or whatever. But yet at the same time, I would be fascinated to kind of go back and sort of do a link between people who say we need to spend more on mental health services, but when a budget appropriation comes up in Congress or a state house someplace, their first reaction is, oh my God, that's going to raise taxes, or I can't vote for that because whatever. I mean, do you sense that there's any kind of consensus building in state houses around the country and even in Congress where people are saying, okay, if we really should put our money where our mouths are. If we need more mental health professionals to come into the field and to support those who are already in it and provide more services, then we're going to have to come up with the money for it. Is that part of the solution? I guess maybe that's where I'm going with that. Do you think that would help?
I think it would help. I remember when I moved to Vermont. I think Vermont was one of the first states to put mental health on parity with medical health. And I was like, oh, that's really great. I mean, I didn't have to, be sure I had a doctor's signature. I didn't have to have some sort of specific referral. A parent could come in and say, "This, I think my kid's doing this and that," and it's like we could start, And now, of course, I usually do then contact the doctor. But the idea is, I think that we should look at the barriers and also the access point. Not sure exactly how that worked, but I know you're working on that right now. So what do you think about those, the barriers and the access points, and how do we shift all that?
To getting proactive,
Yeah.
right? Well, I think it is shifting. I think we've got a lot of money right now so we're largely funded by Department of Mental Health and Community Mental Health, and or Medicaid and or private insurances. It's a combination of things. But I'm finding that the state provides, right now, we've got a fair amount of money out there for training. I don't have money to hire a person to go out and then do the work, but I think we're moving in that direction at the state, and I think we've got, as is always the case, some legislators who are really on it and agree. I did testify in the budget hearings about mental health stuff this year, and it was exceedingly frustrating and challenging. It's hard to be in that arena and be trying to explain things, and I think they have a big job too. I get it. You're right that we don't want to raise taxes, but it's such a bigger picture around things like insurance companies. What were their profits last year? Do they have an obligation to be taxed differently or something so that we can put more money toward keeping people out of the business of crisis? On housing, we can talk about people making money off of real estate and second homes and Airbnbs and all the things, and does that prevent our, one of the things you had asked about is did we all experience this level of depression when we were in grade school and high school? And my answer would be no. And I grew up in a working class family. My father was a mill worker. No, I don't think he ever made more than $20,000 a year. My mother was a secretary, and we owned a home.
Right.
And I never worried about the lights being on or food being in the refrigerator. That is profoundly different, and that comes down to a much bigger economic picture of the haves and the have-nots. I don't think mill workers and secretaries can even imagine the ability to buy a house.
Right.
They're lucky if they can find a rental unit that they can afford.
Which is usually almost more than a mortgage, even rent these
they can
days.
be.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and I graduated just, a little over 20 years ago, so it wasn't that, far off. And I remember, I was thinking about this the other day, talking about thinking of self-harm too. I remember there was this was in 8th grade, I remember a girl who had cuts on her leg, and she said it was from shaving, and only did it click 10 years ago. I'm like, that was never from shaving. But then it was what? Oh my gosh. And the amount of, I shouldn't say girls, but the amount of kids that are self-harming these days is huge.
Yes.
Huge. So that's alarming too, without the intent, for suicide, just as a really crappy coping skill.
Yeah.
Right.
So what should parents do? What would be some of your suggestions? I mean,
Gosh.
beyond sitting down together and having dinner and turning the TV off at a certain point, or
Yeah, well, I think being more present too,
Yes.
there's so, and I find, like you said too, I find myself sitting in the living room and my kids are playing and my daughter's on her phone and I'm on my phone, and my 6-year-old last night actually says, "Can you jump on the trampoline? Why does nobody ever play with me?" And I almost had tears in my eye. I dropped everything and I went and I jumped on that trampoline. My legs are a little sore today. But I think just being present, everybody is so busy doing their own things, and there's just kids. My 16-year-old even just go up and she's in her room, and actually my 10-year-old is the one that's in the room. She'll come down and hang out. But I think just being present and being together, because then you also can see maybe the warning signs that maybe your kiddo is
and modeling
feeling
that
off.
quality of life, balance of life behavior by not being on our phones as much. And I no judgment to any
Right.
parent out there,
We're all
because I
guilty
am,
of it.
my husband and adult kids would tell you I'm probably one of the bigger offenders. But why do I need to sit there and scroll my phone instead of,
You don't, it'll all be there, right?
yeah.
When you look
So
the
I
next time.
instituted family game night, and the kids hated it initially, and then it was like, okay,
Yeah.
and it kind of worked. I won't say it was like brilliantly successful, but what I will say is it got everybody around the
Right.
table to do some stuff.
And you made the attempt, and they noticed that.
And we do still have a rule, even both my kids are in college, no phones at the table.
Yeah.
Right.
same.
So
Yeah.
but the APA, American Psychological Association, did come out with some guidelines, and basically you kind of need to see what your kids are doing, figure out what your kids are doing, and there needs to be a tailored approach to social media for who your kid is and what your kid is into. Now, if they're a cheerleader, I'm making this up, and they're watching cheerleader TikToks, maybe that's okay. Now, if you're just a regular person, you're watching TikToks all the time, I don't think that's okay, you know, and that's TikTok's a whole other thing. I heard about Montana, but then if you go down younger kids, I mean, the American Academy of Pediatrics says really no screens before age 3.
Agreed.
And then anything between like 3 and 5, 6, 7, really you're talking about like what we instantly, well, my wife is also a psychologist, but we agreed right away, only VHS. Remember that? So they didn't watch TV, they watched things that we had taped. And I do remember when my oldest daughter complained about all the girls at wonderful, beautiful Shaftesbury Elementary watching Hannah Montana. I was like, okay, we're going to have to probably cave on that. And they watched they watched 3 or so. We didn't have cable, so we had to have someone tape it for us. And actually, their grandparents did. They were like horrified. But they watched like 3 or so episodes. They're like, thankfully, they were like, this show is really stupid. So that took care of that. So in other words, what you're doing is you're doing a limited exposure to see what your kids do with it. If it's problematic, then you got to do one thing. My kids fortunately are like, okay, this is ridiculous, and
Right.
that was the end of that.
Right.
So I think this idea of parenting the active verb, which of course I can't give names, but many of my patients would say that's what he says all the time. Parenting the active verb, you've got to be kind of involved. I'm sorry, you can't be kind of involved.
Yeah, right.
You've got to be
You
involved.
signed on for a big involvement. I think that anytime I'll use the word negative, I don't really mean it to be negative, but anytime the negative behavior is taking up time that should be spent on positive behavior. So if your kid is getting no exercise or
Yep.
not talking to you, then you need to consider what is he doing with his time. Probably gaming or on his phone or looking at a screen for whatever reason. So that's when in my opinion, you say to a kid, so because we're not getting this healthy stuff happening, we need to talk about how to limit this stuff so that you have time to do this stuff. And it is a very sort of common thing. And I used to say to the families that I saw, I think of parenting as sort of scaffolding. So in the beginning, there's a lot of scaffolding. We're providing every need of our kids. And then as they get older, they can dress themselves, they can feed themselves, they can start to choose their diet, they can start to choose what they do with their time. And then when we see them do something that's eating ice cream all the time and no vegetables, we say, we're going to build up the scaffolding back until you can show us that you can make. And I think we have to think about that with all the time that they're spending is when do we need to provide more structure and support and when can we pull that away? Because if we say no screens until you're 18,
Right.
that's a bad idea. We all know that's a bad idea. But we can sort of encourage good choices around balance by allowing them to make some mistakes and then jumping back in. And that is all about being present because it's the
Yes.
only way you're going to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also being sort of, speaking up for at least like the teenage years, being like the kind of parent who allows your kiddos to make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
Like I have so many kids that are just so anxious because, they got a bad grade on a test or, they got caught vaping in the bathroom, and they're just, their day
It's
is
over.
ruined because their life is now ruined.
Their life
And
is
so,
over,
Right.
yes.
So like I would like to think that I would be the type of parent that like, okay, like not the best choice that you've made, but like this isn't a game changer. Your life isn't over. Like, be the parent that your kid can come to and say like, I messed up.
Yeah.
One of the things I also noticed in the course of preparing for this was a reference to when kids, I guess we're talking mainly about high school kids here, or maybe grade school, are connected to school. They're involved in an extracurricular activity of some sort, or sports, or the theater, or some club. That's kind of a big boost in their
That's a
ability
big protective factor. Yeah, 100%.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we have to keep on
Encourage
encouraging
that.
and,
Absolutely.
them to do it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to loop back before we have to run here to something I think you said right at the start of our conversation there, Megan, about the pandemic. I was kind of interested in that because I found myself wondering as I first began thinking about all of this. Well, this is probably something that is directly connected to COVID and the unusual situation that we all found ourselves in back in the spring of 2020, and that, as you said, we went into hybrid learning and schools were closed and things were disrupted. Since some of the data seems to suggest that, some of this depression rate, predated the pandemic, I guess I just wondered, was that a case where the pandemic just simply exacerbated trends that were already underway, or was it such a monumental event all by itself that just kicked things into overdrive?
Yeah, I think it exacerbated it for sure. I mean, 3 years ago, there was certainly a lot of kids that were struggling. And then it was just like, phew, the floodgates opened.
So my favorite thing about all this, when you think about, Ukraine and climate change and COVID and the shootings and the inactivity of certain bodies in the world and the nation, I think my favorite choice is answer D, all of the above, right? And trying to factor it all out is just really, really difficult. But what we need to do is kind of figure out ways to move forward. And I like what you were saying, Lori, about this. It's here, it's now, it's present. It's probably not going to go. Mark, my friend, is not going to pull back Meta, right?
Right.
Unlikely. But how are we going to adapt to this and manage it so that we can figure out a way to do this? Because frankly, our neurophysiology has not caught up to this, just like Congress has not caught up to laws about the internet and stuff. I mean, we're all lagging behind, and we need to figure out ways to manage it, deal with it, and make it through this.
And now we have artificial intelligence.
Oh, well,
my
yes,
gosh,
yes. This is a whole interesting thing, and my wife and I have been exploring this, and it's amazing and stunning. And but I did hear a good thing, which was one of the writers was on NPR for the writer's strike, and they of course have been experimenting about this because they think they're all going to lose their job. And the one guy said, "Yeah, the script was kind of a B+, maybe. So you're still going to need writers."
Right.
But
But that's a whole nother level.
Yeah, and
kids
a
are
whole other
using it all the
conversation,
time.
I think.
Yeah.
Kids are already writing.
Oh yeah, no,
I can't tell you who, but
Yeah, no, I think the teachers are
I'm sure
slowly
they're
but
on it.
surely catching on.
yes, they're I have this 5-page paper to do. 5 minutes later, here it is, Mom.
Wow.
Oh, how'd you do that? You're so smart. Well, I don't know about that. You're
In a
smart.
sense.
You're adept.
Resourceful.
You're resourceful, but not smart. I don't know.
Potential of all of that, I think, is going to be fascinating to see. I think that's the right word anyway. Well, any final thoughts before we have to run here? I mean, are we hopeful at least that maybe we've seen?
I'm always hopeful. I think my final thought too is that there's so many kids that are struggling, but there's so many that are really doing awesome things and have been so resilient with everything that's been thrown at them the last few years. And it's so easy to focus on this data and the YRBS and all of the high numbers of that, but there's just so many kids and families that are just doing awesome, and it's sometimes you really have to stop and try to focus on those too.
There's not everybody
with
who's
that.
Yeah.
struggling or
And
whatever.
the same kid who might be experiencing high levels of anxiety because of climate change maybe got her degree in, geography and ecology and is out there working to change the world.
Right.
I mean, I do think we have a lot of kids who are out there really passionate about
Yeah.
doing something
There-
different.
there's
And
one-
also maybe feeling anxious and depressed. I think the other
Exactly what I'm saying, it's the same
Part of
kids.
the other thing too is I think people have gotten so, and I know this is a lot of staff at my school and probably others, oh, they need to go to the health center. They're anxious, and it's sometimes like like everybody has a level of
Take away
anxiety.
the pathology there.
Yes.
Right? It's
Yeah.
just so, it's,
Yeah.
I think the word anxiety and depression is a bit overused as
agree.
well. It sort of minimizes the
But
people who
it's
are.
become more clinically significant because if you
Yeah.
break up with your girlfriend and you're depressed, well, it's kind of normal.
Right.
Right?
Right. That's an appropriate reaction to
It's
the
an
situation.
appropriate reaction,
And
yeah.
I do think, and this could be a whole other conversation, but I do think we've created a culture that pretty quickly jumps to pharmacology
Oh, yeah.
to fix the anxiety or depression. And sometimes we could be saying, I get why you're anxious. It makes total sense.
Yeah.
Let's talk about
Yeah.
ways to ameliorate that without.
Right.
And I think there's a very blurred line between saying, here, take these pills to fix your anxiety.
Right.
Oh, but don't smoke the weed because that's not okay. And we're sending very mixed messages
Right.
about how to manage our emotions.
Yes. You're very good.
Yeah.
Well, all right. On that note, then we'll wrap it up. I want to thank again Megan Brooks, the mental health director at Burn Lori Zeef, emergency services director at Rutland Mental Health Services, and Dr. Bob Hemmer, who is a psychologist working here in the Manchester area. Really fascinating conversation. Thank you all for making the time to come and do it. And we'll see where this all goes. Well, summer vacation is almost here anyway,
Yes,
so that's
yes,
good,
like 12
right?
days, I think.
For some people,
Yeah, I
one
know,
person.
For me,
How many hours is
my
that?
mental health is important too, you know.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you who've been watching. I hope you found our program interesting. Thank you for sharing part of your day with us, and we'll see you again the next time. Take care.